Something unusual is happening right now, and most people haven't noticed it yet. Across headlines, we see rising tensions, military movements, and political warnings surrounding Iran. But what's really unfolding goes far beyond daily news cycles. This is not just another regional conflict, this is part of a much larger historical pattern, one that has repeated itself for centuries. Here's what's really happening behind the headlines. Empires, powerful, dominant, seemingly unstoppable, have repeatedly moved toward Iran with confidence. And yet, history shows us something important. Many of those empires didn't leave stronger. They left weakened, fractured, or in some cases, collapsed entirely. From ancient powers to modern superstates, Iran has acted less like a battlefield and more like a geopolitical trap. Now, for the first time in decades, we are seeing the early signs of a similar pattern forming again, this time involving the United States. Let me be clear, this is not about predicting war with certainty. It's about understanding strategic behavior, historical cycles, and geopolitical pressure points. Because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, a pattern begins to emerge. What we're seeing now is a strategic shift, not just in the Middle East, but in the global balance of power. Iran is no longer isolated in the way it once was. It has built regional influence, asymmetric military capabilities, and strategic partnerships that complicate any direct confrontation. At the same time, the United States is navigating multiple global commitments, from Eastern Europe to the Indo-Pacific. This creates a dangerous intersection of pressure, perception, and power. And this is where the analysis from Professor Xueqin becomes especially relevant. His argument is not based on ideology or speculation, but on pattern recognition. His central idea is simple but powerful. Empires don't usually collapse because they are weak. They collapse because they overextend, especially in regions they don't fully understand. Iran historically has been one of those regions. So the real question is not just, will there be conflict? The real question is, what happens to a global power if it gets drawn too deeply into Iran's strategic orbit? In today's analysis, we're going to break this down step by step. We'll look at historical precedents, current military and political signals, and most importantly, future scenarios that could reshape global power dynamics. If this analysis is helpful so far, consider subscribing, because understanding these patterns is no longer optional. It's essential, because this isn't just about Iran. This may be about the next phase of global order. Before we go deeper into the analysis, let's map out the key ideas we're going to explore, because this situation is complex, but the underlying structure is surprisingly clear once you see it. Here are the 6 major geopolitical insights that will define this entire conflict and potentially shape the future global order. 1. Why tensions around Iran are rising now, not randomly, but structurally. Here's what's really happening behind the headlines. This isn't about a single incident or short-term escalation. What we're seeing is the natijat of long-term pressure building across multiple fronts: sanctions, regional proxy conflicts, nuclear negotiations, and shifting alliances. This tension was not triggered overnight. It has been engineered over time. 2. Iran's real strategy is not direct confrontation, it's strategic endurance. Let me explain this with a simple geopolitical pattern. Iran does not need to defeat a superpower militarily. Its strategy has historically been to absorb pressure, stretch timelines, and increase the cost of engagement for its opponent. This is what's known as asymmetric resistance, and it has worked repeatedly in the region. 3. The United States is facing a classic overextension dilemma. History shows us something important. Global powers rarely fall because of one major war. They decline when they are forced to manage too many conflicts at once. Right now, the US is simultaneously engaged in strategic competition in multiple regions, and Iran represents another potential long-term commitment. 4. The real battlefield is not Iran, it's the surrounding region. What we're seeing now is a strategic shift. Any conflict involving Iran will not remain confined within its borders. It will spread across key geopolitical corridors, from the Persian Gulf to Iraq, Syria, and beyond. This transforms a localized issue into a regional system-wide risk. 5. A deeper Iran conflict could accelerate a global power realignment. This is where the situation becomes global. Rising powers are watching closely. Any prolonged U.S. entanglement creates strategic space elsewhere, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. This is how regional conflicts reshape global hierarchies. 6. The most likely outcome is not a decisive victory, but strategic exhaustion. Let's be realistic. Modern geopolitical conflicts, especially in complex regions like the Middle East, rarely end in clear wins. Instead, they evolve into prolonged standoffs that drain resources, attention, and political stability. And that's where long-term consequences begin. These 6 insights are not isolated points. They are interconnected pieces of a larger system. Each one builds on the other. Each one increases the stakes. And together, they point toward a single critical conclusion. This situation is less about who wins a conflict and more about who can sustain it. In the next section, we'll go deeper into the historical background, because to understand what might happen next, we need to understand what has already happened before. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it often follows familiar patterns. To understand what might happen next, we need to step away from current headlines and look at something much deeper: patterns. Because when it comes to Iran, history shows us something important and often overlooked. Powerful empires have entered this region with confidence and left with consequences they did not anticipate. Let me explain this with a simple geopolitical pattern. Iran is not just a country, it is a strategic landscape, geographically, culturally, and politically complex in ways that make external control extremely difficult. And this pattern goes back thousands of years. First, consider the geography. Iran sits at the crossroads of major civilizations, connecting Central Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia. Its terrain is dominated by mountains, deserts, and natural defensive barriers. For an outside power, this creates a logistical nightmare. Supply lines stretch thin, movement becomes predictable, control becomes fragmented. This is not terrain that rewards invasion, it punishes it. Now layer on history. From ancient empires to modern powers, those who attempted to dominate this region often faced the same outcome: initial success, followed by prolonged resistance, ending in strategic exhaustion. Why? Because Iran's strength has never been about overwhelming military force alone. It has been about resilience. Here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Iran has historically mastered the art of defensive persistence. Instead of confronting stronger enemies head-on, it adapts, absorbs pressure, and shifts the battlefield over time. This creates a dangerous illusion for any external power. At first, progress appears possible, but over time, the cost of maintaining that progress becomes unsustainable. Now bring this into the modern era. Unlike past empires, today's global powers operate under different constraints: economic interdependence, political accountability, media exposure, multi-front strategic commitments. This means prolonged conflict is not just a military issue, it becomes a political and economic liability. And that's where Iran's strategic position becomes even more significant. Let me simplify this with an analogy. Imagine stepping into terrain where every step forward requires twice the effort, and every step backward costs credibility. That's the strategic environment Iran creates. And this is where Professor Jiang Xueqin's analysis becomes critical. His argument is not that Iran defeats empires in the traditional sense. His argument is that Iran outlasts them. And in geopolitics, endurance often matters more than dominance. Now, here's the key insight you need to remember. The danger for a global power is not entering conflict with Iran. The real danger is becoming gradually trapped in a long-term strategic commitment that drains resources, attention, and influence elsewhere. Because while focus remains on Iran, other regions begin to shift, other powers begin to rise, and the global balance quietly changes. If this analysis is helping you see the bigger picture, consider subscribing, because these patterns are not obvious, but they are incredibly important. In the next section, we move from history to the present moment, because what we're seeing today is not random escalation. It's the continuation of this pattern under modern conditions. Now that we understand the historical pattern, we need to shift our focus to the present, because what's happening right now is not random, and it's not isolated. It's structural. Here's what's really happening behind the headlines. The rising tension around Iran is the result of multiple pressure systems converging at the same time. Political, military, economic, and strategic forces are all intersecting, and when that happens in geopolitics, escalation becomes more likely, even without a deliberate push toward war. First, the economic pressure layer. For years, Iran has been under heavy sanctions, primarily led by the United States. These sanctions target critical sectors, oil exports, banking systems, and international trade access. The intention is clear: weaken Iran's economy to limit its regional influence. But here's the unintended consequence. Instead of collapsing, Iran adapted. It built alternative trade networks, deepened regional ties, and strengthened internal resilience. In many ways, prolonged sanctions didn't eliminate Iran's strategic behavior. They reshaped it. This is a classic geopolitical feedback loop. Pressure leads to adaptation. Adaptation leads to new forms of resistance. Second, the regional conflict network. Iran is not operating in isolation. It has influence across multiple regions, including Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. This creates what analysts call a distributed deterrence system. Instead of responding directly to threats, Iran can operate through multiple channels across multiple fronts. This dramatically increases complexity for any opposing power, because now any escalation is no longer contained. It becomes regional by default. Third, the nuclear dimension. This is one of the most sensitive aspects of the current tension. Iran's nuclear program has long been a focal point of international concern. Negotiations, agreements, withdrawals, and renewed talks have all contributed to a cycle of uncertainty. What we're seeing now is not just about nuclear capability, it's about leverage. Nuclear advancement, even at the threshold level, changes how other powers calculate risk. It raises the stakes without necessarily triggering direct conflict. Fourth, the military signaling. What we're seeing now is a strategic shift in posture. Military presence in key areas, naval movements in critical waterways, and defensive readiness on multiple sides are all indicators of something important. Not immediate war, but preparation for possibility. And in geopolitics, preparation itself can trigger escalation. Because when both sides prepare, both sides interpret the other's preparation as a potential threat. Fifth, the global distraction factor. This is where the situation becomes even more complex. The United States is not focused on one region alone. It is managing strategic competition across multiple areas, including Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. This creates what's known as a tension dilution. And here's the risk. When a global power is stretched across multiple fronts, even smaller escalations can become harder to manage effectively. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine trying to control multiple fires at once, even if none of them are massive individually. The combined pressure increases the risk of losing control of one. Now bring all of this together. Economic pressure, regional networks, nuclear leverage, military signaling, global distraction. Individually, each of these is manageable, but together, they create a highly unstable system. And this leads us to the key insight of this section. Tensions are not rising because one side wants war. Tensions are rising because the system itself is becoming more fragile. In the next section, we go deeper into intent, because understanding capability is one thing. Understanding strategy is everything. Now we move to the most important layer of this entire analysis, intent. Because in geopolitics, actions can be misleading, but strategy rarely is. If you want to understand where this situation is heading, you need to understand what each side actually wants. Not what they say publicly, but what their behavior reveals over time. Here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Iran's strategic objective, survival through leverage. Let's start with Iran. Contrary to popular narratives, Iran's primary goal is not expansion for its own sake, and it's not direct confrontation with a superpower. Its core objective is much simpler and much more strategic: regime survival. Everything else builds around that. So how does Iran achieve this? Not through direct military dominance, but through layered deterrence. Let me explain this with a simple geopolitical pattern. Iran builds influence not by controlling territory directly, but by shaping the environment around it. This includes regional partnerships and proxy networks, missile and drone capabilities, strategic positioning near critical energy routes, controlled escalation tactics. This creates a system where any attack on Iran does not remain contained. It becomes costly, regionally and globally. This is what we call asymmetric balance. Iran doesn't need to match the United States in power. It only needs to make conflict too expensive to sustain. The United States' strategic objective, containment without entrapment. Now let's look at the United States. Its goal is not regime change in the traditional sense, at least not in the immediate strategic framework. Its core objective is containment, limiting Iran's influence, restricting its nuclear capability, and maintaining stability in key regions, especially those tied to global energy flows and strategic alliances. But here's where the challenge emerges. The U.S. is trying to achieve containment without becoming deeply entangled, and that is an extremely difficult balance to maintain, because containment requires presence, but presence increases risk, and risk increases the chance of escalation. The strategic mismatch. Now here's the key insight, and this is critical to understand. These two strategies are fundamentally mismatched. Iran is playing a long-term endurance game. The United States is trying to manage a controlled, limited engagement. Let me simplify this. One side is prepared for a long game. The other is trying to avoid one. And historically, that imbalance creates pressure. Why this matters? Because when strategies don't align, systems become unstable. Iran increases pressure to build leverage. The U.S. responds to maintain control. Each move is defensive from their perspective, but offensive from the other side's perspective. This creates what we call a cycle of escalation without intention. No one is aiming for full-scale conflict, but each step increases the probability of it. Future scenario to watch. Here's what to pay attention to in the coming months. Increased indirect engagements rather than direct conflict. Strategic signaling instead of immediate action. Economic pressure combined with regional maneuvering. If these patterns continue, it confirms one thing. Both sides are trying to gain advantage without crossing the line into war. But here's the risk. Lines in geopolitics are rarely clear and even more rarely stable. If this analysis is helping you understand the deeper strategy, consider subscribing. Because these are the signals most people miss, but they matter the most. In the next section, we move into the most dangerous phase of this situation, escalation. Because conflicts like this don't start suddenly, they build gradually until one moment changes everything. Now we reach the most sensitive and potentially dangerous phase of this entire situation, escalation. Because conflicts like this rarely begin with a clear declaration of war. They begin with miscalculations, with signals misread, with actions interpreted differently than intended, and in a system as tense as this one, even a small trigger can have outsized consequences. Here's what's really happening behind the headlines. Both Iran and the United States are trying to operate in what we call the gray zone. This is the space between peace and war. It includes indirect engagements, strategic deterrence, limited strikes or responses, cyber operations, and intelligence activity. The goal of gray zone strategy is simple. Apply pressure without triggering full-scale conflict. But here's the problem. The gray zone is inherently unstable because it depends on restraint, and restraint is not always predictable. Let's break down the key escalation triggers. 1. Miscalculation in the field. This is the most common trigger in modern conflicts. A local incident, a strike, an interception, a confrontation escalates beyond its original intent. Why? Because each side feels the need to respond to maintain credibility, and once responses begin, escalation becomes a chain reaction. 2. Proxy conflict spillover. Iran's regional network means that tension does not stay contained. An incident in one location can quickly expand across multiple areas. This creates a situation where a localized clash becomes a regional signal, and regional signals demand broader responses. 3. Strategic signaling that goes too far. Military exercises, troop movements, or naval positioning are often meant as warnings, not actions. But here's the risk. Signals can be misinterpreted as preparation for attack, and in high-tension environments, perception often matters more than intention. 4. The nuclear threshold factor. This is one of the most sensitive escalation points. Even without weaponization, movement toward higher nuclear capability changes strategic calculations. It increases urgency, it reduces tolerance for delay, and it raises the probability of preemptive thinking. 5. Domestic political pressure. This is often underestimated, but incredibly powerful. Leaders on both sides operate under internal pressures. Public opinion, political opposition, institutional expectations. In moments of tension, leaders may feel compelled to act more decisively than they otherwise would. Not because it's strategically ideal, but because it's politically necessary. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine two drivers on a narrow road, both trying to signal strength by not backing down. At first it's controlled, measured, but the closer they get, the smaller the margin for error becomes. And eventually, one small misjudgment leads to collision. Now here's the critical insight. Escalation in this scenario is unlikely to begin with intention. It's far more likely to begin with interaction. A response to a response to a response. And once that cycle starts, it becomes very difficult to control. What should we watch moving forward? To understand whether escalation is approaching, pay attention to these signals. Increase in frequency of indirect engagements, shift from defensive to preemptive language, expansion of military presence in key regions, reduction in diplomatic communication. When these signals align, the system moves from tension to instability. The real risk. The real danger is not a planned war. It's an unplanned escalation that becomes irreversible. Because in high-pressure geopolitical systems, events move faster than decision-making, and once momentum builds, even powerful nations struggle to slow it down. In the next section, we step back and look at the bigger picture. Because this isn't just about Iran and the United States anymore. This is about how a regional conflict can reshape the global balance of power. So when we step back and look at the full picture, what do we actually see? Not a simple conflict, not a predictable war, but a complex geopolitical system under pressure, one that could quietly reshape the global order. Let's recap the key insights. History shows us something important. Powerful empires don't usually collapse because of one decisive defeat. They weaken through overextension. And Iran, across centuries, has consistently acted as a space where outside powers face exactly that risk. Not immediate defeat, but long-term strategic drain. Here's what's really happening behind the headlines. Iran is not trying to win a conventional war. It is trying to outlast pressure. The United States is not trying to invade or fully engage. It is trying to contain without being trapped. And that creates a fundamental tension. One side is structured for endurance, the other is structured for control. What we're seeing now is a strategic shift, not necessarily toward direct war, but toward a prolonged, managed confrontation that carries global consequences. Because this is no longer just about one region. If the United States becomes more deeply engaged, even indirectly, the effects will ripple outward. Strategic focus gets divided, resources get stretched, opportunities open for other global powers. This is how regional conflicts influence global hierarchies. Not overnight, but gradually. And this brings us to the most important prediction of this entire analysis. The most likely outcome is not a clear victory for either side. It is strategic exhaustion over time, a prolonged cycle of pressure, response, and recalibration. A situation where no one fully wins, but everyone pays a cost. And in that kind of environment, the real winners are often not the ones directly involved, but those who remain patient, adaptive, and strategically positioned elsewhere. Let me leave you with this final thought. This conflict may not begin with a dramatic moment. It may not even look like a traditional war, but over time, it could quietly reshape alliances, shift power balances, and redefine global influence. Because in modern geopolitics, the biggest changes don't always come from sudden events. They come from slow, sustained pressure that alters the system itself. If this analysis helped you understand the bigger picture, consider subscribing, because these are the patterns that define the future long before they become obvious. This isn't just about Iran. This may be about the next phase of global order.